Hello YouTube, Tech Shaman here making my YouTube debut. Today I'm going to be talking about 3 ways to memorize Linux commands. One of these ways is an ancient secret, once very common, now largely lost to the sands of time, so please stick around. Kicking off the list at number 3 is just use Linux. Or in other words, don't deliberately try to memorize commands. This isn't my favorite technique, but I included it because I often see it recommended to beginners who are trying to learn Linux commands. The main benefit of this method is that it doesn't require any extra effort on your part. Basically, you just use Linux. As a problem arises, you find the solution using Google, man pages, whatever resources are at your disposal, and over time, through your daily activities of using Linux, eventually you will commit the various commands and arguments and flags to memory. The main problem I have with this method is that not all of us are Linux admins or Linux professionals, and we aren't always repeating tasks over and over again in a way that would allow us to develop that muscle memory, as some people call it. This video is more aimed at people who, like myself, are more hackers or tinkerers, or they're seeking knowledge for knowledge's sake, not necessarily working as a professional using Linux in your everyday job. For those who fall into this category, it would be excruciatingly slow to learn Linux commands just by absorbing them through daily use of Linux. The other major issue that I have with just use Linux is that this method is not going to help you to approach your peak potential when it comes to learning Linux. As an analogy, imagine someone who wanted to become a bodybuilder receiving the advice that they should just do hard labor. Yes, doing a job where you perform hard labor might help you to get into shape, but it's not going to bring you to the same level of peak performance that you would by creating a deliberate program and lifting weights specific to certain muscle groups. In the same way, just learning Linux commands through their daily usage is not going to help you achieve mastery of the Linux command line. If you've ever received the advice, just use Linux, and were frustrated by it, or you agree with any of the points I've been making, please stick around, listen to my other 2 techniques, and try putting them to work for you, because I have a feeling that these are going to help you out a lot. The second technique that I have for you today is mnemonic techniques. Mnemonic techniques are tools that you can use to make it easier to memorize abstract concepts such as Linux commands. The simplest forms of mnemonic techniques just use little word plays such as an acronym, especially an acronym that can be sounded out phonetically, like PEMDAS, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. Another similar method is to take an acronym and apply a semi-coherent statement to the letters of the acronym. Using the same example, PEMDAS, others may know it as, "Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally." For a Linux-related example, I turn to the tar command. If you wanted to extract a tar archive on Linux, you would type in tar space -xzf. One way to remember this as an acronym is tar extract the files. Not only is extract the files easier to remember than xzf, it's also related to the action you're trying to perform, so it works out very well in this case. Using acronyms and wordplay can be a great way to memorize Linux commands and other things for that matter, so I encourage you to use it and come up with your own clever ways to remember abstract concepts. There are other much more powerful mnemonic techniques that you can use to memorize things, though, and I'm going to share a few of those secrets with you now. One of the most powerful techniques for memorizing anything is to use mental imagery in your mind's eye. There are a lot of different ways that you can do this, so I would encourage you to experiment and try different things and find out what works for you. As an example, let's say for whatever reason you wanted to remember the word Washington. Well, one way to do this is to look at the word, and I can see that it's actually made up of two words, washing and ton. So in my mind, I might imagine a washing machine filled up with a ton of clothes, and it's just overflowing and bubbling out, and the suds are flying all over, and I can smell the laundry detergent, and it's loud and rumbling, and I'm just going to imagine that in my mind. You want these mental images to be as exciting or obnoxious or loud or ridiculous as possible so that they really stick in your mind. And you also want to incorporate the use of as many senses as possible while you're imagining these things. The key to memorizing using mental imagery is to imagine something that's really out of the norm that you don't encounter every day. So let's pretend like the word Washington doesn't easily divide into two words that we can turn into objects or imagery. One way that you can deal with that is to say the word out loud. It can sometimes help form connections in your brain that are things that are easily turned into imagery. So if I were to say Washington, Warshington, worship tongue, and now I'm thinking about a bunch of people in black robes gathered around a giant slithering tongue. Perhaps when I said worship, instead of thinking about people worshiping something, you were thinking of an actual warship. In that case, I could say warship ton, warship gun, and now I'm thinking of a warship with a giant gun. And since I'm trying to remember the word Washington, maybe I imagine the warship gun blasting out a giant artillery shell that blows George Washington's face off of Mount Rushmore. Now, hopefully, you're getting a decent understanding of how this works. But let's bring it back to Linux for a moment. For my Linux-related example, I've chosen the command FG, which brings a suspended or backgrounded job into the foreground. Now, for FG, what we can do is we can take the letters F and G and try to think of some object or objects that start with those letters and will help us remember the command FG and what it does. Now, FG stands for foreground, so we could just use that, but it's kind of hard to come up with a mental image for foreground. So instead, I'm thinking of flaming golf ball. And the reason why is because in golf, before you hit the ball, you always see them say four. And also, I can imagine a flaming golf ball coming from behind my monitor, blasting through the monitor and appearing in the foreground. So that works really well for me for that one. Now, this is all good and well, and imagining these things in your mind can certainly help you memorize anything, including Linux commands. There is an even more powerful technique that we can put to use to memorize things. This mnemonic technique goes back as far as at least ancient Greece and can help us memorize things even better than just imagining vibrant imagery in our minds. This technique is often referred to as the journey method or the method of loci. The technique itself is actually quite simple. All you're going to do is create the mental imagery like we've already been talking about, but you are going to imagine that imagery in a physical location in space. So what you're going to do for this technique is imagine yourself walking through a space that you're familiar with, such as your house or your workplace or a park that you love, and make note of the locations of various objects that stand out. So it could be your furniture, it could be your television, certain decoration on the wall or something like that. You want to mentally walk through the location a few times, becoming very familiar with it in your mind. As you familiarize yourself with the location that you've thought of, it's going to become what is known as a memory palace, a location where you're going to be storing memories for later recall. Now, when you're ready to memorize something, for example, a list of Linux commands, certain arguments or certain flags for a particular Linux command, what you do is you imagine yourself in that location, your memory palace. And as you walk through it, you create that mental imagery for whatever you're trying to remember, like we talked about. But what you're going to do is place it in your memory palace in your mind. So, for example, if I was thinking of that overflowing washing machine, I might imagine it on a certain shelf, or I might imagine it next to the TV. And you're going to do that with each one of the items you're trying to memorize as you make your way through your memory palace. Next, when you want to recall the information, what you're going to do is you're going to walk through your memory palace again, but this time, instead of placing information in your memory palace, you're going to be looking for the things that you placed there before so that you can recall what you're trying to remember. Now, be aware this is a very simple explanation for a technique that can take years to hone and master, and a lot of people have dedicated a lot of time to perfecting the methods of these mnemonic techniques. So, bearing that in mind, I'm going to drop a link in the description below where you can learn more about these techniques if you're really interested in putting them to work for you. What I really like about using these mnemonic techniques is that they work very well for storing and recalling information in your mind. The main problem with them is that the information is stored out of context, so you don't necessarily make the connections to the types of problems that you could solve using the commands that you've stored in your memory palace. These techniques do provide a good framework for developing that more advanced type of knowledge of these commands, though, and for that reason I highly recommend using mnemonic techniques to memorize commands, command arguments and flags, keyboard shortcuts, and basically anything in your life that you would want to memorize. To introduce the final method for memorizing Linux commands, I want to go back to the bodybuilding analogy that I made earlier when talking about the first method. If just use Linux is like doing hard labor to try to build up your physical fitness, this next method is the weightlifting of learning Linux commands. The number one method for memorizing Linux commands is arguably the best method for learning any skill, and I'm talking about deliberate practice. A very brief explanation of deliberate practice is that it's a mindful way of practicing a skill in which you have an end goal in mind and you are focusing on what you need to do to better achieve that goal. With deliberate practice, rather than simply repeating a task over and over again, What you want to do is break that task into different parts that you can focus on, and then master each of those parts so that when you combine them, you're much better at that skill that you're trying to perform. For example, if a pitcher were working on improving their fastball, they might break that down into how they're holding the ball in their hand, how their arm swings, the follow through, how the rest of their body is moving, and maybe where their eyes are focusing on. I don't know, I don't play baseball, but that might be what they do. And then when they've mastered each one of those things, they're going to combine it all to throw the perfect fastball. The most difficult part about incorporating deliberate practice into something like mastering the command line is figuring out how to do that. I've come up with some ways that I believe will help anyone who is trying to more efficiently master the Linux command line. The first method I've come up with is basically just using an online resource or a book that contains a compilation of Linux commands and finding a command that you think would be valuable or useful to know. Once you've identified a command you want to learn and you have some idea about what it's supposed to do, before you even run it, just imagine what you think is going to happen when you run the command. Do you expect output on the screen in the terminal? Do you expect a file to be created? What do you think this command is going to do before you even run it? Just think about that for a minute before you actually run the command. Now what you should do is try to run that command and look at the results. Were they what you expected? Was there output on the screen? Was there an error? Did it create or modify a file you were working with? What happened? If the results were not what you expected, think about why. Why weren't the results what you expected? Did you have the arguments in the wrong order? Did you leave out an argument that you needed? Did you need a certain option to get the command to run in the way that you expected it would? Experiment with the command, with or without success, and just make mental notes of what happens when you do different things with the command. Once you think you have a good grasp of the command, go ahead and dive a little bit deeper on it. Either use a search engine to search for more information on the command, or pull up the manual page for the command on your system and look at some of the more advanced options. Think about how you might put the command to work for you in a practical situation. What type of problems might you solve with it? This type of deliberate practice is really all about experimentation and focusing on how you can make the command line and certain commands work for you and achieve what you want to do with them. Another type of deliberate practice that I think is very useful is something known as hacker challenges, or some people call them war games. The most basic hacker challenges are pretty much puzzles that require you to put knowledge of the Linux command line to use to get to the next level. One of the best hacker challenges that I've come across, especially for beginners, is the over-the-wire Bandit challenges. The Bandit challenges can be found on overthewire.org. The first Bandit challenge on overthewire.org is actually to figure out how to connect into the Bandit system so that you can access the Bandit challenges. If you're attempting to connect to the Bandit challenges from a Linux system, you can use secure shell, which is the SSH command, and if you are on Windows, you can use a utility called PuTTY to connect to the Bandit challenges. The Bandit challenges are actually a series of puzzles that require you to use Linux commands to figure out the password to the next level. Each challenge is progressively harder, and they do get fairly difficult. I'm not going to give away any of the solutions for the Bandit challenges, but there are others who have done so. I highly encourage you not to look at those answers and just to work through each challenge on your own. And if you get stuck, just back off of it for a bit and take a break, and maybe later the answer will come to you. I will say that as you get further into the challenges, there are more than one way to solve the problem, and oftentimes the one that seems very obvious it's a very tedious process to carry out. And normally you don't have to spend a lot of time on these challenges. If you find yourself doing something that is going to take a very long time or it seems very tedious, there's probably a more elegant solution if you just look into the commands that they are recommending for you to use to solve the puzzle. Alright, I'm going to wrap this up here. I hope this information is helpful. I'm going to include a couple links in the description. One is going to be the resource on Mnemonics that I mentioned, and another one will be a link to a book published by O'Reilly, the Linux Pocket Guide Essential Commands. I have the second edition of the book, and I find it to be very useful. It contains a lot of information about Linux commands, how to use things like pipes and redirection, and all sorts of other useful things for anyone who is trying to learn Linux. It's a great resource just to keep on your desk so that you can access it whenever you need it. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like this in the future, please subscribe. Thank you and good luck in your Linux journey.